Good morning. The last session, the tough one. Thank you all for being here. I really would like to thank Angus Australia for inviting me to talk this morning. Peter mentioned some of the data that I'm responsible for at MLA, and I'm a bit of a sicko. I love my data. But what I'm going to talk to you about this morning is really, really difficult to share with you all publicly in terms of making it available on the websites. And that's because we've got some really great information about our consumers, who they are, what they want, how they rate Australia as a beef supplier, and how they rate some of our brands. And you can imagine if we put that on the website, our competitors would love to get their hands on it. So I really do appreciate the opportunity to speak this morning. I'm not going to spend as long as I would like talking about all the insights we have. I'm going to do it really, really quickly to give you a feel for what we have. And in this morning's session in this room, we talked a lot about brands and positioning and marketing and communicating to consumers. And I just want you all to know that as producers, the type of information we have available is available to you. So it's just a matter of getting in contact with MLA and asking for it. So don't be shy. So this morning I'm talking about understanding our consumers and delivering to their needs. I'm mostly going to focus on the consumer at the point where they're making a decision about which protein they're going to choose to buy. So we've got a lot of information along the supply chain, but I'm going to talk about the real pointy end, about where they've got a choice and they're faced with a sea of options that they can choose from. Before I do that, we need to understand who our consumer is. So I will talk about the global landscape and who our consumers are before I jump into how do we meet their needs. So starting with the global landscape, and at this level I'll talk about Australian beef quite specifically. So I don't think this will be a surprise to anyone, but on your left-hand side, what you're looking at is total global beef production and the countries that contribute to that. So what's surprising about this chart in particular is the size of Australia. So we're only 4% of global beef production. We're one of the smaller beef producers in the world. But when you have a look at the right-hand side, in terms of exports, we're 17% of all global beef exports. So one of the smallest producers, but one of the largest exporters. What that means, if I'm talking about consumers, is we obviously have a lot of consumers that are global consumers. They're not in a single country. And then if we think about where those consumers are, they're global, and where they are has changed with time. So if you look 15 years ago, so on your left, 2004, the likes of US and Japan made up over 80% of all of our exports. If you have a look at last year, you can see that the rest of the world now makes up 51% of our exports, and each market is becoming increasingly important. We do have competitors though, and all competition isn't equal. Now this is an average chart, so for this room, it's not reflective of your product. We're looking at average price per kilo of Australian exports and versus our competitors. But what you can see on here is, back in 2010, our price was almost equal to the likes of Brazil. And the gap between the base price and the highest price was around $2. But more recently, that gap is even wider. It's more like $5 per kilo. And you can see that Australia is starting to split away from the rest and move up the price spectrum. So we need to continue to do that. And the only way to do that is to differentiate our product from the commodity product. So really quickly, We're a small producer with a big impact in global markets, and the opportunity for us is really about differentiating our product. So before I tell you how we differentiate, I'll tell you who our consumers are. So this chart quite simply is showing you the population forecast out to 2023 for different countries. Now, you could start with population as an indicator of where our growth potential might be. And you start to see things like, well, China's 1.4 billion people. It's about 4 times the size of the US. Or a market like Japan, China's is more than 10 times the size of Japan. What's important to note about the size of the world is we've got about 6.5 billion people, and Australia's beef production is never going to meet that demand. So a better way of considering where our product can go, and we've got a high quality product versus most of our competitors, is thinking about where are our consumers that can afford our high quality product. So on this chart, we're starting to have a look at one of the indicators of affordability. So this one in particular is looking at the number of households in a country that earn over 75,000 US. Now, this isn't necessarily the mark that we always use. Sometimes we use lower, but given the quality of the product in this room, it's a more appropriate number. But you'll remember when we were looking at population, we saw that China was 4 times the size of the US. When you start to look at it this way, and this is a forecast out to 2023, US is 10 times the size of China. And we saw that, from memory, China was 10 times the size of Japan. When we look at affordability, Japan is twice the size of China. So this is a way to start thinking about where our consumers might be. But we have an even better way. At MLA, we've done a number of research studies in the developing markets in particular. So across China, Southeast Asia, and the Middle East. They're big markets, but as you saw from the affordability slide, we need to find where that consumer is in that big market so that we can target them. So within that study, what we've identified are not just the country, we've identified the cities within those countries that are more likely to be more attractive for us to target. And in those studies, we've got a top 5 cities in each of those countries or regions to target. Then once we've gone into those cities, we've sought to understand who is the consumer, where are they, where do they shop, where do they go when they go to a restaurant, and what are they looking for. So we know about the consumer and we know where they're buying their beef. So I'll just give you 2 slides which are an example of this study, because what's important is what the consumer's looking for this morning's session. But this is looking at China, the Attractive Cities work, where we found 5 cities. We have 15 in total, but 5 in terms of the top priority. And what we know about those consumers in those cities, on average, so the grey bar, you see a fairly high proportion of them have eaten Australian beef in the last year. When we go a step further and we have a look at the affluent consumer in the top 5 cities, you can see an even higher proportion of them have consumed Australian beef in the past year. Similarly, we've done the same work in Southeast Asia, and the same thing again. So in the grey, the city average, you can see a high proportion of consumers have eaten Australian beef in the last year. And when it comes to the affluent, an even higher proportion have eaten Australian beef in the last year. So you haven't learned anything about what they want yet. But what you have learned is where our consumers are. And I haven't shown you that for every country, but we do have that information for every country about where they are. So now that we know where they are, importantly, what do they want? So I'm going to share with you a very, very slim snippet of information we have about consumers. And it comes from various research sources that we have. So I mentioned the attractive cities. We also do an annual consumer survey across 16 international markets to understand how consumers perceive protein, how they consume beef, how they consume Australian beef, and then the types of different beefs that are important to them. So to start with, we have asked across 16 countries how consumers can tell quality when they're buying a steak. Now, this is how consumers describe it. So you can see the first one is around the colour, the second one is around the marbling. The third one starts to get interesting because the second one is marbling and the third one is lean. Lean is all relative. So, for example, in Japan, lean means there's still visible fat. They're comparing to a high marble Wagyu, for example. Anything leaner than that is lean, compared to a market like Australia, where lean means no visible fat. Then you can see the fourth one is a particular country, and I can tell you for Australian beef, we are well positioned. We are a country of origin that is preferred, so tick for that one. And then you can see a brand. So this morning's session talked all about brand, and you can see that at the point where the consumer's making the decision about, will I buy that one or that one, brand starts to play an important role. Well, what's interesting though is the 10th one. So these are the top 10, and consumers tell us many more than 10. The 10th one is the breed of cow. So in last year's survey, we started to ask about breed of cow. And possibly not surprising to anyone in this room, when we asked consumers across markets about which breeds they're aware of, Angus does have the highest awareness. So I know in the last session of this morning in this room, we talked about awareness being the first thing that you need to have to be considered to be purchased. You're in a good spot there. All right, I might explain this table so it's not so easy on the eye, and you're going to see 3 of these, and once you understand the first one, it will be easier. So I mentioned we do research across 16 markets every year, and I've put on this slide, just for your eyes' sake, just Australia's top 7 export markets. And then down the side, I've put the top 7 things that consumers relate to being important for depending what the heading on the slide is. It's just the top 7, but there are over 20 attributes that a consumer will tell us. So in this particular example, we ask consumers when they're considering to pay a premium for a protein, what's important to them. So this is at protein level, it's not at beef yet. So the first thing they say is, if I'm going to pay more, it needs to be the most superior meat. The good news here is that in every country that we research, except for the 2 Middle Eastern countries, beef is considered the most superior meat. The second one is that it tastes delicious, and the good news here is, in every country, beef is the one that tastes delicious. Same with my family's favourite and high nutritional value. The next 3 are not necessarily beef specific. So consistent quality standards, the animal is well cared for, and guaranteed safe to eat. Those 3 things are what starts to split the decision for the consumer. So if they're standing, for example, in the retail shelf, and they've got this beef and that beef, and one of the beefs got all of those things plus the bottom 3, they're more likely to pick up the one that does all of them. One of those attributes that you saw on that prior slide was safe. So it's one thing for us to assume what a consumer means by safe. It's another to actually ask them what they think. And so no surprise, the top attribute that they rate with safety is that it's safe to consume. What's interesting is the other things that a consumer describes about what's important in relation to safety. So the third one is all about what's not in the meat. It's about the no hormones, no antibiotics, no additives, no chemicals. And the fourth one is about how it's grown or raised and about the animal. Which is interesting because the top three from when I'm paying a premium are all related to this. And related to safety is traceability. Now, we don't ask consumers about traceability because that's not how they would describe it. We ask them how important it is to know where the animal has been and what it's been treated with. And you can see the degree of importance that it has across every country. So the average of the global responses is that 86% of consumers say that it's important to know. And you can see that the countries towards the bottom where they have high food standards, it's slightly lower, but it's still high. And then we go a step further and say, all right, so when you're about to make that purchase and you're standing there looking at the shelf, what is it that you're looking for on the pack to help you make a decision? And what's interesting is the top three things, the first one being quality, again, the second one being safety, again, and the third one being all natural. And then you can see things like colour, price of meat, used by date. And then the bottom three, you see again this idea of antibiotic-free, no added hormones and no preservatives. So we've looked at what safety means, and we've looked at quality before. What does all natural mean? Another one of these tables. So in a consumer's mind, natural is a little bit similar to safe in that the top attribute is about no hormones, no preservatives, nothing added. The second one is about free range, and the third one is about naturally farmed. So thinking about meeting consumers' needs, they're all interrelated. So with all of the data that we have, if we have a look at the high-level things that a consumer thinks about when they're making a decision about buying this protein or that protein, we come up with the same answer. It's about consistent quality, safe, natural beef from well-cared for animals. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Natalie, for a great presentation. Has anyone got any questions for Natalie? Down here, get a microphone down to Sam. Mic's on its way, Sam.
Yeah, thank you for a great presentation, and we appreciate the nature of the information as it's intended. My question's about use of antibiotics. While they say no in the general run, this question was put last night, I think, to the panel. Is there a perception no antibiotics at all, but if an animal's sick or healthy, or unhealthy, what's the perception there, or is that not part of that data?
It's a good question. It comes up all the time. It's not part of this data. One thing I'll say about this data is at the end we were looking at when they're choosing between proteins. And so one thing in a consumer's mind is the perception because of chicken and in terms of the additives in chicken. We are specifically about on pack. So the data's not looking at, has it been treated with antibiotics because it was sick and now it's not in the meat. It's the end part that it's not in the meat for this data set.